Well, hey everybody, it's Matt Nelson here with the Word on Fire Institute, and today I've got the pleasure of being joined by Sarah Clarkson, all the way from the United Kingdom. So thanks for joining me, Sarah.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
So Sarah, you're an author, well, and people might know who you are already because I've done an interview with you in blog form, so people can go to the blog and search Sarah Clarkson, and they'll find us talking about some of the other work you've done, aside from what we're going to talk about today. But you're an author of many books. You're a mother of, is it 2 children?
2. So
That's
Lillian
right.
is 2.5 and Samuel is 8 months.
Right. Yeah. So you're busy, but you've still found the time though to write these books and to work as a graduate student at Oxford, where you've recently completed your master's. And today we're going to be talking about suffering in the Gospels. And I'm really excited to talk to you about this because you spent a lot of time thinking hard about this topic, both for personal reasons, but then from a more professional or academic perspective. This is essentially something that you thought about and wrote your dissertation on at Oxford. So you've got an upcoming book, which is going to expound on these ideas you have on beauty and theodicy. And then also, like I've kind of hinted at, there was, things in your personal life that led you to want to jump into this area of research. So I'm going to step back and, if you could, talk a little bit about this upcoming book. And I already threw out this big word theodicy out there. Make sure you define that. And then talk about what led you into that area of research to begin with.
All right. So the book is called This Beautiful Truth, How God's Goodness Breaks into Our Darkness. And I feel like my whole story is kind of a part. So I did the academic study on one side, but it was funding the creativity on the other. Most simply, I was diagnosed at 17 with OCD, which can be very mild, but mine was extremely debilitating, and it was a form where I was just plagued with troubling and violent and dark thoughts, and you just have no control over what happens in your brain. And I'd been raised in a Christian family, really discipled. My parents both became Christians in college, and so were really passionate about their kids knowing the Lord. But all of a sudden, all the things I knew about God didn't seem to be true anymore, because if God was good and if God was kind and if I was saved, what did that mean if this evil could basically take up residence in my mind? And so I think that was kind of that as a crisis of faith and life that set me on this course of questioning. I think my question has not been so much about God's existence as about his goodness. And how do I know his goodness? And what does it look like for us to live in a broken world and to still call him good? And actually, that's basically what the word theodicy means. It literally means to kind of justifying God. Like, how can we justify his power and his goodness when we live in a world where such evil things happen? And on an academic side of things, theodicy is often the study of, well, usually God is either powerful or he is good, but how can he be both of these things if he either allows evil things to happen or does he cause them? So I think that those were a lot of my formal questions, and I did do a lot of study of that. When I finally got to Oxford, I like to say I took 12 gap years, which was largely me figuring out mental illness and life in the modern world and all of that. But I finally got to Oxford when I was 30 and started studying, very unexpectedly studied theology. I was always a literature girl. I always thought if I did end up in higher education of any sort, it would be literature. But I took one course at Wycliffe Hall in Oxford on doctrine, and I fell in love and discovered this term theodicy. And I think just knew that I wanted to write and study it. But I realized the farther I went, I wanted to look at a specific view, because I think a lot of times we approach suffering by trying to argue people into believing God's goodness. Well, there's these 5 things you need to believe, and yes, you're in profound suffering, but it's God's will, and that's what it means to be a believer. And some of those responses were the ones that I think pushed me farther and farther away from my faith. But what I did see God do throughout my illness and throughout the years of darkness was he broke into my story with these moments of beauty, with the affection of good friends, with moments of literature and art, with moments in nature where I felt like I experienced his goodness in a way that allowed me a taste and encounter with him that renewed my capacity to believe that he was good, even if I couldn't understand exactly why these bad things had happened. And so the more I started studying theodicy at Oxford, I realized that there are ways of thinking about theodicy, and I would actually say the book of Job very much reflects this, where we realize there is a huge mystery to suffering. And yet what we see is God breaking into suffering. We see him arriving on the scene, and he comes, like in Job. I think it's so interesting. You have this whole drama of suffering, and then God arrives on the scene, and his answer is, look at what I've created. Look at the stars, look at nature, look at these beautiful things I've given you. And I think it's almost a plea from God for Job to witness this beauty and goodness and to believe. And so my book is very much just going through, it's my own story. It's bits of the theodicy I've studied. It's looking at a lot of, I think actually stories can be a great form of theodicy. So I would argue that The Lord of the Rings is actually a piece of story theodicy that Tolkien wrote from his own experience of evil in the First World War. But the book is basically, my story of the way that God's beauty broke into my darkness and allowed me a different kind of encounter with his goodness that allowed me to keep walking forward in hope. And I think that that's what we need to offer a suffering world, is God's goodness, encountered in a taste and see immediate way. So that's, yes, in a nutshell.
Yeah, no, there's so many things that you've raised there that I think we will cover as we move forward over the next few minutes here. So you've thrown a few teasers out, and hopefully we can follow up on some of these things. Do you have a title for this book yet, so that people can keep their eyes open for it, or are you still working on it?
It's called This Beautiful Truth, How God's Goodness Breaks into Our Darkness.
Okay. Well, we'll definitely be watching for that. And I can testify to the books you've already written that they're of the highest quality, and books that my wife and I recommend to many people. So keep an eye open for Sarah's next book. I know it'll be good. It'll be great. And today, I guess, will be a little bit of a trailer for that too. And so let's not waste any more time getting into some of these topics that fall under this massive heading of suffering in the Gospels. Well, why don't we just start with a fairly general question? I'll let you take it in whatever direction you want. Talk about how Jesus in the Gospels interacts with suffering.
Yes. Well, I think that one of the first things you see is where Jesus encounters suffering people, he comes with healing. He comes with, it's almost like in the Gospels, as you watch Jesus go through the people, you watch the world being recreated. And I think that that's one of the first important things to see about how Christ interacts with suffering in the Gospels. It's very much to start with story. If you know the story Lord of the Rings, you know that Aragorn is this hidden king, and he's been kind of exiled from his kingdom, and there's always been this prophecy that he would return. But how do people know he is the king? And there's this beautiful, I think, story that Tolkien has woven where this prophecy becomes the hands of a king or the hands of a healer. And the people recognize him because he comes through the gate not in triumph or domination. He comes quietly in and begins to heal his people. And the people recognize their rightful king because he's their healer. And I think that's very much the image of what Christ does throughout the Gospels. He heals, he saves, he calls people forth. I think it's fascinating to watch, like even that story of when a woman touches his cloak and he says, "Who touched me?" He has this insistence on that people not just be physically healed, but they understand the fullness of what has come to them, that they understand that they're forgiven and that they're made whole and they're called into relationship with their Creator. And so I think for me, there's a David Bentley Hart quote where he says, "If it is from Christ that we are to learn how God relates himself to suffering, evil, and death, it would seem he provides little evidence of anything other than a regal, relentless, and miraculous enmity. Sin he forgives, suffering he heals, evil he casts out, and death he conquers." And this, I think, is what is the pattern of what you see in the life of Jesus as he moves into the world, declaring the kingdom and bringing healing in its wake. And I think in that sense, if you think about Genesis as being, God creates the world and orders it and calls it to life and fruition. I think that's what Jesus is doing. He's calling it back to life as he moves through, and you watch, people's lives changed and healed wherever he goes.
Yeah, there's a real paradox that we uncover as we read the Gospels, because Jesus he comes to heal and restore. He defeats evil and death through his own suffering. And yet, not only does the restorer and healer come and suffer and ultimately die, but also he asks us to take up our crosses and follow him.
Yes.
So at the same time, while suffering is being defeated through his life and ministry, death, and then resurrection,
Mm.
there's still this call to suffer and suffer with dignity, and ultimately rejoice in our sufferings for the sake of others, like Paul says in his letter to the Corinthians, or sorry, to the Colossians. So talk a little bit about this play between suffering has been defeated and yet it appears not yet kind of thing.
Yeah, well, I think that the first thing I would say is, I think the more I study this, the more I realize we sometimes think of suffering as something that happens to some people, but everyone will suffer. Like, to be human in this world is to be broken and to suffer and experience that. And so, in some sense, to walk with your cross is to take the suffering you will inevitably encounter. But I think that taking up the cross, I think it was really interesting to me when I was studying theodicy, how much the problem of suffering is related to the problem of power, and how we use power and what it means for God to have power. And I was reading a lot of Hans Urs von Balthasar in his Theodrama, where he talks about, what the drama of Christ's suffering and crucifixion means. And he talks about that, and I think you see this in the life of Christ. God is the most powerful being in the world. I mean, our power is contingent. We have power and freedom because God gave it to us, but we're dependent upon a creator to give it to us. Christ is free. And he comes into the world, and in Balthasar's words, God, who has this perfect freedom, gives the most precious thing he has. He pours out his life unto death for us, to empower and heal us. And I think that the taking of your cross is the call to live that cruciform way of suffering, that instead of it being something that cuts you off, makes you against the world, creates a bitterness, there's this openness to self and to trust God's mercy as it works within our pain. But I also think, and this is one of the most marvelous things about Christ and the Gospels to me, is there's kind of this backwards magic that happens in suffering. What Satan intended for evil, these darkest places of our lives, and this is what I talk about a lot in my book. It's not that God needs those to make his will done, but when we bring them to him, they become the place where his beauty grows, because he will take the places of our deepest pain and make them the point where we begin to see his light, where we reach towards hope out of a broken world, where we become capable of compassion. The life of Christ working in our sorrow kind of transforms it into something entirely new. And so I think, in a sense, I also think of that taking up the cross in that sense is when we offer these places of sorrow to him, they become the place where his kingdom can come in this very unique and radical way within our darkness.
Yeah, the word you use there was transformation, which I think really gets to the heart of what's happening, particularly through Christ's passion, death, and resurrection. And what he takes the greatest evil that humankind could commit, what Dr. Peter Kraft has called fittingly deicide, the killing of God. God came to save us, and we killed him, and yet God, in his eternal and infinite goodness and generosity, converted our greatest fault into the greatest of victories.
Yes.
It's incredible. And you mentioned the book of Job when we first got started in this conversation today. And I was recently reading G.K. Chesterton's essay on the book of Job. And there he says, we often see the book of Job as being about evil or the problem of evil. But Chesterton argues, in fact, it's actually about providence. And so anyways, we often see evil as just something that is purely evil and that nothing good, can potentially come from it. And yet that's not necessarily the Christian worldview. Can you talk a little bit about the book of Job, even though you've already started, and just shed some more light on what we find there when we turn to that Old Testament book?
Yeah. This was one of the writing of this paper that made me want to study theology forever. Job is fascinating because it's a drama of questions. So you have God asking this question, have you considered my servant Job? And then you have the Satan figure asking the question, yes, but will he be good if you trust God? And you have Job asking questions about, why does this happen to me? It's this drama of questions. And one of the scholars I found really helpful was a scholar called Gerald Janssen. And really interesting, I think he had pancreatic cancer in real life. And so he really came to his study of Job with these huge questions of suffering. But what he talks about is that in the ancient world at that time, there was a very kind of tit-for-tat understanding of faith. So If you did the right things, your God would bless you, and if you did the wrong things, then God would punish you. And Job is a radical departure from this, because Job has done nothing wrong. His friends think he must have done something wrong, because according to the way the whole world thinks, but Job is an innocent sufferer. And I think in that sense, you see there's this mystery and drama that is, I think is, yeah, we live in this tension where we don't get to see what's happening in the heavens. But what Job is called to, and this is what Janssen talks about, is he is called to this maturation of his faith, where he's no longer saying, I will trust God because of what he gives me, but I will trust God because I believe he is good. And he's called forth. And the way he knows that goodness is by encountering his beauty. Because I would say that God is not, I don't read those passages as God thundering down saying, just look at my huge world, just be quiet and submit. I think he's inviting Job to look at the goodness and to step forward and to come into a relationship with him and to say, this is a broken world, but I see. And that's what Job says at the end, I have seen and I have known, and now I will be quiet. Because he has in this sense encountered such a profound experience of God's goodness that though he has lost everything, though there's still the questions, there's no explanation in the sense of this is why this happened, but there is a conclusion of relationship with God and God blessing Job because of his faithfulness. And I think that in a nutshell, that's what we're called to in suffering. We don't, no one has ever, I've never received any revelation about why mental illness is permissible, or, why horrible images can invade your mind. I don't think we are given those explanations here in the broken place, but I think I look at the world and I see the fallenness, and I understand the narrative of Scripture, which is that we are marred by sin, and that there was a rebellion, and that we live kind of in enemy territory. And knowing that, that I'm called, therefore, to look out of this suffering and say, will I turn from God because I don't understand and I want the answers, or will I walk into this kind of beautiful wilderness where I am reaching towards his goodness, I'm encountering his goodness, and I will come to this new place of walking with him. So I think Job is in many ways kind of what we're each called to, but it's quite a wrestle, I think, as Job really does. I mean, one of the things I love about Job is that God just sits back and lets him say everything he needs to say. There is no condemnation for Job, pouring out his sorrow, railing at the heavens, but he is still considered righteous because he chooses to continue to relate to God. Actually, he's considered righteous because he insists, I have done everything right. No point does he go back on all the goodness he kept before. So yeah, I could go on a lot more about that, but it's quite beautiful once you get into realizing this play between God and Job and these questions, and how Job has railed against God, and then God says, just wait, let me say something. And then he shows him the pageant of creation. I think it's quite a startling and beautiful story.
Yeah, and there's a bit of a parallel that we can draw between what we see in the book of Job and then what we see in certain parts of the Gospels in terms of material loss, which often, we conceive of the greatest evils in our life as being, something temporal or something material in our lives taken away from us. And so when we think of God's providence, I think sometimes, especially, today, there are unfortunately Christians, and maybe sometimes we even fall into a mindset where we adopt a similar view, where we expect that, like Job's friends, like if there is this loss suffered in our lives, and we must have done something wrong. But if things are going really well, materially, in our lives, then yes, we must be in God's great favor, which, I suppose could be true, but of course, God's ways are not our ways. So it's not like doing a sort of spiritual calculation to figure out whether or not, like, what our standing is with God. But, we see Jesus challenging the rich young man, for example, to give away everything. If you want to be perfect, give everything away, or sell your possessions, give it all away, give to the poor, and come follow me. And we could draw these parallels elsewhere in the Gospels as well. But yeah, talk about, again, this distinction between material loss or temporal loss, but then this idea of providence being something offered sometimes on the spiritual level, where it's sometimes we miss what God is trying to give us because it's not observable, it's not palpable to our senses, but there's something greater going on.
Yeah, I think this is one where I've struggled a lot, because I think that early in my journey, someone said to my mother, who was also, I mean, obviously her daughter was having a hard time, and then there was a lot going on in their lives, and someone said, well, I wanted to feel sorry for you, but I can't, because obviously this is God's will, and you just need to figure out what he wants to tell you. And it was a very kind of instrumentalist view, like, well, if you just figure out the lesson in this, then it's all okay. Whereas I think that the tension is between, like, I think that God genuinely brings mercy and grace into our suffering. So I think he looks at this profound loss we have, I think particularly with kind of those deeper cutting losses. I mean, like, God is present in all our loss, but I think the providence aspects to me, and I think there's different views on this, but it's that what was intended for evil can in God's light become good. So he is able to work within it. As the Sam Gamgee, everything sad is coming untrue. There's Makoto Fuji, I don't not never say this right. Makoto Fujimura, I think, has talked about a Japanese tradition of where you take broken pottery and you seal it back together with gold, and it makes this the end result is kind of so stunningly beautiful. It's more beautiful than the original, and I think that is how I would see. I guess the providence of God in suffering is in his economy and in his presence. What we would count as being the worst things that could happen to us become the place where his golden light comes and weaves us back together, and we become kind of vessels that show forth his goodness and beauty. So I think when I think of providence, I think through all the years of just where I think for mental illness for me held me back from so many things, and there were so many losses. But I feel like along the way, I saw God leading me into these deeper paths of prayer and a knowledge of him in a way that he filled the emptiness made by suffering with himself. And I think that that's how he radically transforms the darkness that was meant to destroy us, becomes in his presence the place where we are able to taste and see his goodness. So that's probably a bit general, and it's one of those, it's hard to, I hesitate to say God causes this just so you learn this, but I think that God fills what is broken with himself.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of. I love the imagery of the broken pottery sealed with gold.
Yeah.
That's a really nice way of putting it. Well, one of the things that we want to be careful about is to not appear as though we're saying you have no reason to be unhappy or you have no reason to be sorrowful. That's not what we're saying. Do you talk about grief in your book, and what do the Gospels teach us? And in particular, is there anything Jesus teaches us about grief?
I think one of the most profound and freeing and gentle verses in Scripture is one of the shortest, that just says Jesus wept. I mean, this is the Son of God who has all the power in the universe behind him. He knows he's about to raise Lazarus from the dead. He knows what's going to happen. He knows he's come to redeem the world. And yet he stands at the tomb of one of his dearest friends and he weeps. And I think that one of the things we are not always good at in the Christian world is lament. Because I think we often want to either answer and figure out suffering, we want to figure out what it's good for, or we want to, kind of beat it in a way by explaining it. But I think that often what we are called to and where God comes is when we sit and say, this is sorrowful. But I think that sorrow, we're both given the freedom to grieve deeply in the presence of Christ. I think that God is present with us when we are weeping. I think that is throughout Scripture. God is where those who are suffering. He is with the brokenhearted. He is with the poor in spirit. That's throughout Scripture. This is where God is. This is where his heart is. But I also think that being allowed to grieve becomes quite a witness, because if you grieve something, it means you recognize this is not how it ought to be. And in that sense, I think it's very much an honor to God, because to grieve something is to say, God, I know this is not death and destruction and loss. This is not what we were created for. We were created for hope and wholeness and relationship. And our grief is a witness to what we need to be healed and the healing that we hope will come. And so in that sense, I think that God is never threatened or disappointed in our grief. I think that when it creates the honesty where we begin to be able to speak our need for him and to speak I love Frederick Buechner. He has such really insightful writing from some of the loss in his own life. And he did a fascinating book where he used a line from King Lear, where King Lear is brought to the end of himself. He's lost everything. It's tragedy. And he stands on a cliff. He's blinded. He's about to try to take his life. which right after he says, the weight of this sad time we must obey, speak what we feel, not what we ought to say. And Buechner writes about how four people, so I think it was Mark Twain, Gerard Manley Hopkins, Chesterton, and I always forget the last one. I can't remember. Look up the book. Talks about how these people wrote the deepest works, that their most masterful works of story and poetry out of the most dark places in their lives, because when they brought themselves to be able to grieve freely, they found that they had the word, the most honest word they'd ever spoken. But out of that honesty came these works of profound hope and beauty. I mean, the beauty you see in Gerard Manley Hopkins' poems, or Chesterton's works, or even the insight into human character you see in Mark Twain, they're profound works of hope in that sense. And so I do think I think you see Jesus grieving the suffering that he's come to heal, and that he is showing us kind of a holy way to deal with our grief.
You kind of see them in story doing something similar to what we, just talking about the Japanese pot with the gold. That's a sort of blunt way of putting it. Not as shimmering as the way you talked about it, but that's kind of what you see these writers doing. And Tolkien is a great example of this. Like, you don't even necessarily realize you're reading a book that's really dealing seriously with the problem of suffering and death and sin and these things, because there's so much beauty wrapped into the story that implicitly is giving us hope as we're reading, sometimes great tragedy in these books. I'm thinking of Chesterton's book. Is it The Man Who Is Thursday? Did I get that
I love that. A nightmare.
Yeah, right. A nightmare. But then you read it and you're laughing through most of it. And of course there's profound insights, but that's a book that's dealing with these things we're talking about today. And yet sometimes you don't realize just how deep they're going on some of these very sobering questions, because they found a way to wrap gold into their stories in order to give us hope. Talk a little bit about Tolkien, because I know you've thought a lot about his work and how he's contributed to how we think about God and evil.
Well, Tolkien is like a very dear writer to me. So in my year of crisis when I was 17, I was just so confused and so angry. I was like, God, I don't believe in you. I'm not reading the Bible. And so for a year, I just would not touch anything. But I started reading Lord of the Rings, and I think God was in his gentle way chuckling, because I really believe Tolkien wrote the Lord of the Rings. And I think the biographies bear this out. In a way, it was his working out what it looks like to trust in a light and high beauty. There's a quote in I think it's the third book, where it says, it's where Sam and Frodo have gotten deep into Mordor, and Sam looks up out of this profound darkness. They're kind of in despair. They're both kind of starving. It's the ring is too heavy, but he sees a star, and he says the beauty of it smote his heart. And in that moment, he believed in a light and high. The darkness was a passing thing, and the light and high beauty was forever beyond its reach. And I think that Tolkien was seeking to offer his own generation kind of a picture of that light and high beauty and what it looks like to walk amidst darkness and continue to hope. And he's a fascinating figure, and this is largely what I wrote about in my dissertation, because in a generation that was called the lost generation, so this is the generation that came back from the wars, and this is when kind of the rise of secularism and this total loss of belief happened, because there was kind of the suffering of that time was so profound that many people lost their faith. And so Tolkien's contemporaries were people like Great Gatsby, and I'm losing names, but
Fitzgerald.
Basically, yes, exactly, Fitzgerald, Hemingway, kind of these very existentialist, nihilistic works that just say, well, there's existence, and then you die, make the most of it while you can. And Tolkien, in stark contrast, same age, very young man, he's lost two of his best friends in the war, and he comes out of the trenches and begins to create this epic story about evil and goodness and light and beauty. And I think it was his answer to the profound darkness he saw. And there's John Garth has written a great book called Tolkien and the Great War. And he actually says in that book that he believes that Tolkien's work after he came out of the trenches, particularly his composing of who knows if I'm saying it correctly, but the Ainulindale, which is the account of the creation of Tolkien's earth, that it was a kind of theodicy, as he was trying to explain how darkness had come into the world and what it might mean to follow the light. But I think that what's really interesting to me in studying his work is that in an age in which the rise of secularism, the loss of belief has been kind of across the board around the world. Yet you have this, I mean, The Lord of the Rings is one of the most successful books in history. And I think it's because a generation craving hope and light and beauty tasted what was essentially a Christian form of that in The Lord of the Rings. Because I don't think you can have the beauty that Tolkien portrays without Christ haunting the background. So I really believe that that's what he offered his generation and the world to come.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it seems to me, I might have to fact check this with our mutual friend Holly Ordway, who's a fellow of the Word on Fire Institute and in Oxford right now for research. It seems to me that in the trenches themselves, Tolkien did some, like he would write his history of Middle Earth and work
Yes.
on, he worked on
As
sort
he
of,
was going.
yeah, as he was going in the middle of this, of fighting this ugly war. So, you know, I think people just don't necessarily realize sometimes just how much there is contained in this little well, I shouldn't say little trilogy. It's not little, but there's just so much there. That's why people reread it for a lifetime.
Yeah.
You know, I'll throw
Well,
one.
I would say too,
Mhm.
I think that is an instance too of like, I guess I talk so much, I just really don't think we can answer suffering with argument. But
Yeah.
I think that Tolkien has operated as that embodied, beautiful answer to suffering. I think a lot of people read Lord of the Rings, as I did, and find hope in a way that an argument really has failed to give them. And so I think in that sense, it's a very powerful series because it is answering some of those profound questions we ask in the midst of suffering in the language of story, in the language of imagination.
Totally. And I didn't even plan on telling this, but it just came to my mind, a small memory from visiting Oxford last year with Bishop Barron. We were there for just shortly after St. John Henry Newman's canonization. We were at Oxford and we paid a visit to J.R.R. Tolkien's grave. And when we were there, it had been a little rainy that morning, but there was a letter under a rock on his tombstone. And it was in Spanish, and the only one there who could read it was Bishop Barron. So he read it to us. But at the end of the letter, it said, it was a letter to J.R.R. Tolkien, and it said, "Thank you for saving my life," signed, and then the name of the person. So this person was literally testifying to the work of Tolkien, who was not, in the professional sense, a theologian, was not a philosopher. He was a storyteller. And this person was thanking him for saving her life. It was a very moving and poignant experience to see that.
That is beautiful.
Yeah. Well, let's. I just have two more questions here for you, and so these are big questions, and I understand you could talk for hours about this stuff. So people have to read your book to get your full take on these things. But
There you go.
Let's talk a little bit about the power of Christ. So, when the problem of evil is talked about, people always talk about how, and this goes back to the ancients. Well, if God is all loving and all powerful, then it follows that he would want to do anything he could do to prevent evil, and he could prevent evil because he's all powerful. Yeah. And yet it seems to us that he doesn't. He allows these things to happen. Can you talk about the power of Christ and how that plays out then as we see suffering in our lives, and what do the Gospels have to teach us about Christ in that regard?
Well, I mean, I think that there's different theological answers to it, but I think that as I studied, what I found really compelling was how can God be both good and powerful and still allow this? And I think for me, part of the answer has been saying, well, what kind of beings would God, who is love, create? And I think he would create beings who had the power to love in turn. That means if they have the power to genuinely love God, they have the power to genuinely turn from him. And I think that that's the problem with power. And the Balthazar says that it is almost always associated with evil. When you have power, you have this capacity to do evil. And if you look at the Trinity, the life of the Trinity, power in this is always relational. It's always a gift to the other. It's this outpouring of self and love and creativity. Whereas I think the fallen use of power is the self turned in upon itself. In Curvatus, and say, I always get this wrong, but basically the Latin term for the self enclosed, that this is the opposite of what is intended for us when we were created. We were meant to image the power of God, which is never a dominating power. I mean, God is greatly powerful. He will bring his will about in the end. But the primary way he expresses power is in creation. It is in love. It is in redemption. And I think you see this in the Gospels, how many times you see Jesus refuse a worldly kind of power. When he, refuses to be crowned, he refuses to be made the huge Messiah figure. He says, "Don't tell who I am." When the crowd tries to take him after he's fed them and crown him king, he escapes in a boat across the lake. He is intent upon refusing the kind of power the world sees as what we all ought to crave, which is the power to impose our will upon another. Whereas Christ's form of power is to pour out his life for the other. And I think it's very much the Philippians 2. He did not, he poured himself out unto death. And this is the image of the kind of power that Christ gives. But it's very positive. I think, too, the more I've studied this, I think we often forget this kind of power in the modern world, because I think that we are so formed by a Nietzschean idea of power, which is the will to power, that, the greatest use of yourself is to dominate. It is to assert yourself upon the world. It is to make sure your will is done. And it's just not the image of power we see in Scripture. God is strong to save. He is, the suffering servant. And I think that's what you see Christ imaging throughout his life, right up to the cross, is this profound and radical, and to the world, foolishness. It is, if you read what Nietzsche said about the cross, he just hated it. He thought it was the most despicable, stupid thing he'd ever heard. But he also recognized how powerful it is, because he saw that there was something happening in what Christ did to offer his life that was different from anything else that happened in history. And that's what I think, that's the kind of power we have to understand we are redeemed by. That's the kind of power that invades our suffering. It's not one that, just zaps us into submission. It's one that invites us into healing, that walks with us, that allows us to grow, that kindles us to then be part of what he's doing in the world. So I think that's a bit of what I'd say about Christ and power.
I wonder if that Nietzschean influence has anything to do with some of the scandal that, skeptics will have when they see or when they hear this idea about God permitting evil. Because it's like he has the power, but he's not doing anything about it. And I think like the temptation then is for people to think, oh, well, sometimes God's just indifferent to these things. But God is never indifferent to our sufferings. And, it starts with St. Augustine, right up St. Thomas Aquinas to modern day philosophers and theologians. They reiterate the point that when God allows suffering to happen in our lives, he would never do that unless somehow, and granted, most of the time we don't see it, but somehow there's a greater good. It goes back to the Japanese pot again. God is doing something with this suffering that we might not be able to see, but ultimately there's a greater good. Now, again, arguments don't often have the force we wish they had, and it sounds nice, but it doesn't necessarily feel compelling sometimes to us. But the case in point is Christ's death and resurrection.
That is his answer to suffering, is to suffer with us.
Totally.
He doesn't stand apart from us and say, learn, just get your act together. He comes, and by bearing our suffering, transforms it.
Yeah.
I think God cannot be tempted by evil. He doesn't need evil agents or events to accomplish his will. He's perfectly capable of creating, but he will take what is fallen and corrupted and broken and make it his own. And I think that that's what's so incredible about the life of Christ. There's sorry, I quote things all the time. I hope that's okay.
That's great. Yeah.
I've been reading a lot of John Baer, because my husband is really into his books right now. And I've been loving what he's saying about the crucifixion, because he's saying this is how we understand who God is the crucified Christ, who by his most human action, this is John Baer speaking, an action which expresses all the weakness and impotence of our created nature, Christ shows himself to be God. And I think whenever a theologian says this, it's good. He says the profundity of this puts one at a loss for words. The transforming power of God is demonstrated through the death of Christ. And so I think that where Christ is, our suffering is transformed into God's power and life. And that is the radical truth that we can grasp in our suffering. God is never standing apart from us. He is invading it. He is Emmanuel, God with us, transforming our darkness.
That's interesting. This idea of being at a loss for words when we face this great act of mercy and salvation from Christ, and maybe it sheds some light on ultimately the solution, if you want to put it that way, to the problem of evil is that at the end of the day, it's in silence that you'll come to the solution. It's not going to be through a syllogism or through even a story, even though they have a part to play. But ultimately, the answer to it is something that you'll have to face existentially in the sort of silence of being, to get super metaphysical about it. But it's something to contemplate, though, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move. Sorry, did you have something to add to that? Okay, let's move into one more question, and then we'll set you loose because you got lots on your plate. All right. So here's my last question for you. Talk a little bit to close here about God's closeness to us and the significance of God's closeness to us as we suffer, and if you can tie that into what the Gospels tell us about Christ's closeness to the people around Him.
Yeah, I think that the thing that suffering does, and I think this is kind of the intent of, I think this is one of the huge evils that is wrought in the world, is that suffering, when we are in pain, the first thing we feel is separated from God. And I think that is the easiest thing to believe, is that because I've suffered, God is absent. And I think that is the great temptation. This is what I talk a lot about in my book. My huge temptation in suffering was to believe that because I have suffered, God must not love me, or God is not here. And what I've come to realize through all these years of wrestling with suffering and God's presence is God truly is Emmanuel, God with us. From the first moment of the fall, from the first time that darkness came to what He created, his intent has been to invade and redeem it. And when we suffer, and I think this is what you see with Jesus, the whole image of Jesus's life is the powerful God of the universe being clothed in what Chris Rice calls wrap our injured flesh. I love that term, our injured flesh. This image of the Godhead being clothed in our woundedness, and by being amongst us, being touched by children, being touched by those who were ill, touching in turn those who needed Him. He comes where suffering is. That where those, I think this is throughout Scripture, but I think you see in the Gospels the fulfillment of this, that God sends Christ, and Christ is Emmanuel, God with us. And I think that for me, throughout my these many years of walking with God, I think I've just come to realize that He is always there in the background. He's not in the background. He is there in our suffering, and He is in many ways the only thing that can be as close to us as our suffering, if that makes sense. Suffering is so intimately destructive of our identity and our expectation, our hope. But Christ is the one who is right there in the very heart of our darkness. That I love St. Teresa of Avila, how she talks about this interior castle where the beloved dwells. And I think the more I've walked with the Lord through suffering, I've come to this knowledge that He dwells so deeply within me, that He is constantly transforming this darkness as it threatens to overwhelm me, that He is there as, amidst my OCD. There's just a presence of God in suffering that is, I think, His answer to the evil of the whole world. The givenness of Himself is Jesus with us.
Yeah, it's, just to go back to that idea of silence, it's being in the presence of a person, you encounter the solution to the big problem. Yeah, it's in a person. It's not in an argument or any kind of prose or even poetry. It's in a person. And yeah, and so what you've just said, I think, hits the nail on the head, this idea of God being close to us. Well, Sarah, I wish we could just keep on going. There's so much more to be said, but we'll cut it off here. As we're saying goodbye, do you have a title or two that you would recommend to people for books that they could turn to on this topic?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I tell everybody to read some Tolkien.
Sure.
And then a book, I guess one of my favorites, it's kind of a short book, but it's by David Bentley Hart, and it's called The Doors of the Sea. Okay. And it was written after the tsunami, the Christmas holiday tsunami. And it's just a really good, I tend to be attracted to the books that really wrestle, where there's kind of this acknowledgement of the mystery and the beauty. And I just feel like he has done a beautiful account of, what it looks like to wrestle with God, but to look for His beauty, to count on His hope. And he also addresses some viewpoints that I think are really some of the theology that can be really hurtful in the midst of suffering. And he kind of takes those on by the head, and I kind of love that about him. But that is definitely one of my favorites. But then I also tend to be honest, I tend to love novels as answers to suffering. So like another one I'd say, I think Lila by Marilyn Robinson is just an incredible exploration of what it looks like to follow the inner world of someone who has been so profoundly crippled by trauma and to watch a heart redeemed by love. And I think seeing love come into her darkness, I think that's just one of the most hopeful books in that sense that I've read. So yeah, those would be just two off the top of my head.
People could probably just get your book, Book Girl, and I'm sure they'd get.
Well, there you go. That is true. I think I do.
Plenty
have
of
a list in there.
recommendations.
But I'm the kind of person that actually needs to have the book in front of me to remember what in the world I've read. I love books. I write about books. You ask me what I love. I'm like, have I ever read a book in my life? So, but those two for sure.
Yeah.
But yes, I think there is a list in Book Girl as well.
Yeah. So people have lots of books they can get. They can stack them right next to their Word on Fire Bible, and they could dive into the Word and start to unfold some of these great mysteries. Sarah Clarkson, thank you so much for taking the time to join me here. We went over time, but you're so gracious to stay with me here and talk about something that you've thought very deeply about. And thank you for the gift that this book will be to Christians looking to further understand the great mystery of God and evil.
Well, thank you. It's such a pleasure. And yeah, I'm really honored to be here. So thank you so much.